Thank you.
Well, I can attempt an answer. So I have the same problem that you have with that document, but I still think that is actually, you know, the documentation from the infrastructure side that I am aware of exists. I think from a Geo perspective, I mean, at this moment in time, we don't offer anything to GitLab.com because it's not available, right? But if it was available, right, I think the initial thought is it would allow for complete streaming replication of the Postgres database, and it would essentially create a read-only secondary GitLab.com instance, not necessarily at the same scale, but that would allow for faster recovery time in terms of if something really went wrong. But I think there are also several sort of considerations for the future. I think the first step is to actually enable Geo on a smaller scale, maybe only for the database, then add the data sources that Geo supports, but Geo doesn't support everything that is on .com, right? And then I think ideally, right, my hope is that maybe in a year, right, what we actually have is a system where we have regular failovers between two sites, right, on a cadence that is acceptable to the business, right, with compliance considerations.
Yeah, just to further that, I think the two most important things that GitLab, that Geo will offer GitLab.com is, as Fabian has said, they're the faster recovery times. I think that at the moment, some of the backups that are taken and that we restore from are in the sort of 3 to 6, if not 12-hour backups. And that has the potential for either data loss or some corruption there. So I think faster recovery time is a huge thing. And the second thing is also we're selling Geo to some very big customers. And when they hear that we're not running it on GitLab.com, they ask a whole bunch of questions. And I think by running this ourselves, we're also giving the customers the confidence that this is a solution that works and is useful and provides value. And for us, the biggest value is the faster recovery.
Yeah, I think like if you want to separate those two things, there are several angles to this, right? The one is actually offering a better DR system to .com, right? That's the .com interest, but also from sort of a product angle, having Geo enabled on a very large scale instance gives confidence to our customers. And also it is, I think, aligned with our dog fooding value, where we probably have a larger number of sort of scalability issues in Geo that we have not discovered yet because, you know, it is currently not run at the GitLab.com scale. I think a recent example that sort of indicates that is we had some relatively slow database queries that made it very hard to sync, I think, LFS objects when you get a lot of them. And catching those things in the process is actually quite valuable for us as a team. So that's also a consideration here.
I just thought I'd raise my hand. I've never used the raised hand option in Zoom, but apparently it's there. Yeah, just, I guess, complementary to that. So at the moment, there are 2 different DR databases that are currently running, and one of them is delayed. I believe that's a few hours, and the reason for that is to give us a period of time to recover lost data, whether it's accidental, incidental, those types of things. And then there's another one that is more up to date, but it is designed to be used for analytics. As far as I'm aware, it's not actually being used in a DR mode. It's being used for running queries and things like that. So as well as offering another more sort of accurate, or at least a faster replication, we would also be replicating the non-database content. I think that's the kicker for the Geo side, is not only will we be replicating database content, but sort of in the early stages for selected projects, like all the Git data, all the LFS objects, and all the other data types we support. So it's not just the database content; it's also the project data related to the All Things project. So, and just one other thing, the streaming replication, back in Fabienne's point, whilst that is our preferred and the optimal way to implement Geo, in the context of GitLab.com, we won't be able to use streaming replication, at least at this current stage, because it is not configured for the existing DR databases. So we would use a write-ahead log, which is like the reason for that is to protect the primary database clusters from any sort of bottlenecks that may occur on the consumption side for DR, not impacting the main production database cluster. So not streaming replication, but WAL. Yep, gotcha.
You said two different DR databases currently running. You said one was for analytics, which would make that production. What is the other one? Which environment is that in?
I'll just, in the background, try and bring up the architecture diagram. I think one's called DR delayed and the other one's called DR archive. And I'll just try and find the diagram.
Yeah, the DR delayed is running on a 6-hour delay.
Cool.
But the intention is that neither of those environments are going to be used for Geo. They've asked us to keep those as separate entities entirely.
The DR archive is used for the analytics?
That is my belief, yes. I just posted in the Zoom chat the link to the...
And DR delayed is used for quick recovery?
Yes, to give us like Rachel said, a 6-hour buffer to recover data for customers. Sorry, Rachel.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's a buffer in case something goes wrong. They can pull it straight out of the delayed without having to go back and recover from backup. So they've asked us to leave those alone and not to include those in our work at all. We need to do something completely separate to those.
Does anyone know how databases are currently configured?
When you say currently configured, in what sense?
In the sense like what is the AHA configuration and all of that? Do we have that written down somewhere? Does anyone know?
I believe there is some documentation in the infrastructure handbook on how the database cluster is configured. I believe it uses Patroni.
Yeah, it does.
But other than, I'm a little bit out of my depth here. Other than that, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure I've seen a diagram.
Okay. So basically, we would be introducing a third type of database replication.
Yes, and the plan at this stage would be, so referencing the database infrastructure diagram would be to consume the same write-ahead logs from the same Google Cloud storage.
Oh, okay.
I think there is a line of investigation to understand if there is really no way we could use streaming replication, because from the reading that I've done, it seems that the write-ahead logs was a recommendation, and the only POC that was built at the time. There was never a proper investigation done into what the impact of streaming would be. So from some of the issues that I've read, I think they might be researching that avenue correctly, but I think for the moment we just need to proceed as if we're using the write-ahead logs from that same cloud storage location. We can always change it later on, I guess.
Yeah, that's right, we can.
But again, the first thing that we're trying to do is get this onto staging first. I think that by getting it onto staging first, we're proving to ourselves that we can also do this in the correct way. We're going to be using the scripts, not just spinning it up manually. It's also just to build trust with the infrastructure team that we're going to do this the way that they'd like us to do it. And I think we're going to get a lot of learnings out of putting it on staging, which we'll then take forward to when we do it on production.
We will have to replicate everything, right? Like the whole database, whole 2-something terabytes. Did anyone do any sort of cost estimation on the database size alone?
I asked the infrastructure team if there were any cost considerations that needed to be like kept in mind. And they said we just needed to keep a minimal, in staging, we just needed to do it in a minimal way. So not to have a whole, not to have multi-node, not to have massive clusters of anything, just do it with, I think at the moment the recommendation is 2 machines because one is not going to be big enough. And then take those learnings through to what needs to happen in production. But they've said that we don't have to be too concerned with overrunning on cost there if we're going to keep it minimal.
Yeah, at this stage, with the current way Geo is configured, we need to replicate the entire database, even though in the early stages of this on staging, we plan to do what's called selective sync, where we can select just a few projects. But unfortunately, whilst the selective sync will just sync the project-related objects, it still needs and still replicates the entire database. So, yeah.
I'm trying to take notes as fast as I can, so I hope that you're also reading what I'm writing, but we have this recorded anyway.
Yes, you're doing an excellent job. So we will be using selective sync, and it is it does work. It just unfortunately means the database still has to be replicated in its entirety. So
the problem with keeping the cost down on staging is that it doesn't give us any representative example of what's going to happen in production. Number one, the cluster in staging the size of the database in staging is small. So even if we automate all of that stuff, if we don't do one-on-one what we want to do on production, we're still going to run into a number of problems, and then time that with a different size of, multiply that with a different size of databases. So I would definitely recommend that if we are going to start this, that we start with doing the minimal scenario cost estimation, and then not the optimal, but realistic. And then if something goes over that, we will have an understanding of why, right? If it goes over in staging, we have a different problem. The second thing that worries me is if we cannot do selective syncs at all, I'm kind of concerned how are we going to be able to minimize the scope, or rather minimize the impact on whatever, right? Like we have a bug in code, we need to re-replicate everything. Are we going to do this over and over again all the time? What comes to mind is Elasticsearch. The problems that we had enabling Elasticsearch with the size of GitLab.com. And the only way it was resolved, or rather unblocked the work, was that we were able to narrow down what we want to do and test while we are fixing the bugs. And I'm talking about DB only here, which is not even the largest problem that we have with this whole problem, or with this whole system. So I would kind of recommend that we see what can we do to right, like plan ahead with we want to do the whole thing, but then also have a parallel alley where we are trying to find out whether we can start smaller. We're going to see a lot of blockers, I think, here.
Well, I think that's why we were looking to start this on staging, because I'm expecting that staging is going to be, I don't expect that there's going to be straightforward to get it onto staging. And I think it's already going to show us a number of things that are challenging for that data set in itself. Mm-hmm. And then I think GitLab.com is going to be like on another level of the challenges that we're going to find on staging. I think the concern with going too far ahead with moving on to production first is that I'm worried that we're going to land up getting blocked and then just getting into a stage where we can't unblock. And at least if we're moving forward on staging, we're still going to achieve something, hopefully in a faster time frame than what it would be on .com. And at least if we have it on staging, we can start using those learnings back for our customers. We can start building a more robustness for the problems that we find there. And we still have some value, even if we can't get it all the way to .com.
My warning, put it in air quotes here, is based on what I'm seeing right now happening with Puma, on like the whole development of Puma that is happening right now, which is staging went through flying colors, like past everything, and then we didn't have any traffic. We didn't have any way to actually replicate even like a part of a real world traffic. And we moved to Canary, which in this case is not even an option because this is production. So we might need to find a way how to simulate some of these things, like simulate some of the real world production impacts on the database if you want to have some confidence. So that's going to take some extra time for sure. And it's not only going to be geo work, it's going to be other work as well. That's
so when you say simulate some of the things that we're going to encounter on production, do you mean, I'm trying to understand some examples of what that might be.
So, for example, we have an abuser inserting hundreds of rows of, creating new projects, doing all of that stuff. When I say hundreds, I mean thousands. And then we also have like CI usage that actually continuously affects the database. We have the, like workday start and workday end cycles as well. That also increases the load on the database. You have the scale of the whole cluster affecting each other. So delays in replication, network issues, and so on. None of that we can see in staging easily because there is nothing on it. Not to mention that I'm not even sure what our state of monitoring is on staging. We have some alerts, we have some monitoring on it, we have some logging on it, but how good that is, how much data that is going to give you while you're doing this thing is a question. And I'm not trying to say we're not going to do any of that. I'm just saying that managing expectations.
Think about it. Yeah. So when I think about what the concerns are there, it sounds like a big concern is the amount of activity that is going to happen on GitLab.com is not represented anywhere else. And the only place we're going to see that is on GitLab.com. But I think that the way that Geo is architected, the way that everything has to go through the database and we take everything is replicated through to a secondary. There's already a replication mechanism in production at the moment that's going out to both of those DR, the existing DR environments. We're simply going to be adding a third that's reading from the same cloud storage location. So I don't see that there's going to be any place on production. And
do we have that on staging?
That's what we need to figure out for putting that on staging. And because of that, the Geo installation that's running on a secondary is going to be sucking from that cloud storage and then making the request back to production to pull across any other data. And if we find for whatever reason that the secondary is actually causing problems, we can disable it. We'll make sure that through staging that we have the right monitoring in place to just disable it if it's not working. Mm-hmm. And there was a third thing that came to mind. I think it's mainly that. I don't think that the stress on the database is going to be enough to cause problems because it's already a mechanism that's used.
Okay.
But I take your point that when we put this on production, it's a complete step change because it's going to be the biggest traffic that has ever gone through a Geo system. I mean, even when this was used to do the GCP migration, it was a year ago, and GitLab was a completely different size a year ago.
Exactly.
Database was a different size a year ago.
So the only reason why I'm mentioning this to you, Rachel, is that it took 3 years to move with Elasticsearch especially because of these type of issues. The amount of data that passes through, and 2 terabyte database is not, it's not humongous. Like, there are bigger databases in the world, but what is going to be crucial for this whole effort is having a way to do smaller chunks so that we don't get completely stuck. Because if we start this and then in the middle we realize too much data is passing through the system, we cannot limit it. Let's go and do 6 months sorry, my cat is climbing the wall basically. So like, if we have to take 6 months then for Geo to redo parts of the architecture so it can accommodate that, I would rather like try to think ahead a bit and see what kind of options we have, and whether any work that you're doing right now in Geo can take that into account.
No, for sure. And I think the only thing that springs to mind might be the way that we process events. But again, this is processing events on a secondary that is separate from the production system. Even if we turn the secondary off, and we're still filling up the database on that secondary, and we're still filling up all of the and we're still just developing a queue of work that needs to be backfilled in, I don't see that having a massive impact on the production side. But again, I think the only way that we're going to find this is by doing it. A lot of the customers that use Geo at the moment are running it at scale. Obviously, probably not the scale of GitLab.com, but sorry, Ash, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to, didn't want to cut you off. I think one thing we can do, and just to sort of reiterate what you're saying, is we'll be replicating a third DR style database, which does not sort of create any back traffic. So we won't be impacting production by creating that additional Postgres cluster. But it's the secondary Sidekick jobs that will hit production that are likely to be the cause of any elevated load. And so one thing we could do to mitigate that is to only, and I might be showing a bit of naivety around the Canary cluster, but we could point the secondary at the Canary cluster, which from what I understand...
No, I'm sorry, I had to cut you off right now. There is no such thing as Canary cluster. Canary uses the production database. Canary uses production Redis. The only thing, Canary uses production sidekicks. The only thing that Canary actually does have is web workers, API nodes, and not even Gitly nodes. So Canary is just production with an asterisk.
Yeah, but it's a separate set of application nodes, and it's taking aside the data store side of things. So yes, while so the suggestion was going to be to use the Canary so in the Geo setup you have a primary and one or many secondaries. So we could point the secondary at the Canary endpoints, which means the requests go through the Canary application, API, server, infrastructure, but ultimately will be serviced by the same database production cluster and Redis and things like that. But it will mean that I guess we can reduce the number of HTTP requests coming into the public GitLab application servers.
Canary is
just one way to...
Canary is already like very much stretched too thin. With the past 2 weeks of events, all of the traffic that is hitting it is basically public. And we've been struggling to see like, what can we do about it? Or rather, should we even continue using the Canary as we are using it right now, given all the limitations I already told you. Like Sidekick is not using, we need to be careful what kind of code we deploy and so on and so on. So it's going to take more work there if we want to take that approach.
It was just a thought. But it's, Canary is invaluable, I think. But that's just as a side thing.
It is. If only we had time to actually sit down and create a proper Canary, and then also re-architect part of our application to be able to use it. Because Sidekick's namespacing we don't have, which means we have old and new code running in parallel in production. And multiple times in the past year, we had an event where we had to rush through to production because of non-backwards compatible code. So I wouldn't bet my horses on Canary. So I would rather try to find a different way to get this done.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is implementation detail.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in. Oh, sorry, Fabian.
Yeah, I just wanted to also get back from the technical details, just to give you my 1 minute summary of what I would like to see. Right? I personally expect a lot of insufficiencies in Geo to surface throughout this, right? And that's kind of the point as well, right? I would like to see them, right, in order to fix them and also inform, product development with that in mind, because I think the R will become more important, right, or is already quite important to our customers. I think on the technical level, I think what you surface is how can we do that without impacting the production system in a negative way, right? I don't necessarily have an answer. It would be great if we had a proper staging environment and a really nice canary. I don't think we do, right? But we have to figure out a way how to sort of work within that system, because that's sort of my perspective on it, right? It's like,
Fabian, what I'm trying to say here is not that we shouldn't be doing this or that. It's more that you understand what kind of technical limitations we have from this side, so that you know when you're writing your own code, when you're prioritizing your own things, you know what kind of things you need to kind of keep an eye on or think about. The second thing I wanted to kind of raise is one of the other concerns that I have, at least, is that I'm not really sure whether, I know Geo is not DR for now, right? I think we cannot count on Geo being a full disaster recovery system. Am I correct in that or not?
No, you're correct.
That's correct.
I'm correct there. That would mean that we are going to this cycle of compliance and preparation for IPO or going public, whatever we call it these days, where one of the questions is, what are our disaster recovery scenarios? And I'm not the one working on that at the moment, but I know that others will have to work on it soon enough. They're not working on it yet. And the question that is popping up is, if we're going to invest a lot of time into working with Geo, whether that will actually benefit us on GitLab.com if we have to think of other ways of doing our disaster recovery. So whether this is going to be a duplicated effort between different departments.
So I think when it comes to looking at disaster recovery for compliance reasons, and I mean, there's disaster recovery just because it's a good practice, it's good governance anyway, aside from all the compliance side of things. One of the things that becomes very important when looking at this from a compliance perspective is one of the huge things that they always ask is, how are you improving your disaster recovery? What have you done to improve this in the last quarter? And even though Geo is not in its current state a disaster recovery tool that we could actually use and say, yes, you push the button and you've got everything, what we can say is there are continual improvements that are happening all the time to improve the disaster recovery capabilities of this. And every quarter that goes past and every report that we file about disaster recovery, we're able to say, in the previous quarter, we couldn't replicate these data types. Now it's included in an automated system. We've been able to remove the manual piece of this work entirely from this process. It's now automated, and we can continually have the same story repeating itself every quarter. And I think that that's a very compelling story from a compliance perspective that covers quite a lot of ground when going through any type of audit.
Okay.
And in terms of duplicated effort, I think once this is up and running on GitLab.com, I think that's the right time to then start the discussion of how can this start to then take over some of the disaster recovery responsibilities that exist in other places that are currently either manual or part automated. And when it comes to the recovery perspective, are probably very, very manual.
Implementation detail here, Rachel. Now, something sparked while you were saying this.
Yeah.
Would we be doing this all work in one region, or is Geo what's the word? Reliable, I guess, enough to work across regions, and is it sturdy enough to withhold the network jitter, network disruptions, and so on? Because that might be a way forward if we say like, hey, we are going to do this in a completely different region.
I mean, Ash, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the plan is to do it in another region, but still to keep it in a US region. The complexities of taking it in a region that are outside of the US, we get all into data, legal, GDPR, data stuff. So the plan is to do it in another US region.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think one of the benefits of Geo is that it was originally designed to operate on, spread out networks. So there is, a lot of people say, why don't you just use like rsync to replicate files and things like that? But inside, there's actually smarts built in to deal with latency and retrying, and so it is designed to work in completely different parts of the world. So yeah, again, at the scale of GitLab.com, we haven't used it that, but it has been designed to work spread out.
How do we, like when we start enabling, I know I'm going ahead, but I need to understand this thing. When we start enabling different sources, so other sources that we have, what was LFS? Actually, wait, what does Geo currently replicate? Repositories, wikis, LFS objects, attachments, CR artifacts, pages, container registry, not supported.
We don't do pages, we don't do container registry.
Well, I can send you a link.
Well, I'm reading it right now. Well, basically, we do have object storage for a number of these things, namely attachments, artifacts. Those are all in object storage. LFS as well, I think, even is in object storage.
It can be.
It can be.
I'm not sure if productions is.
I can find that out quickly. Well, I'm not going to find it out in this call, but I can find that out. Which means something that we currently don't have is repositories. What we currently don't have on GitLab.com is repositories, wikis. So basically Git projects. If we decide to go down that route and start enabling like repositories, or wikis might be easier as a first attempt. And number one, how do we ensure that this does not affect running GitLab.com? And then second, again, the same question is there anything built into Geo that would allow us to limit the scope and say, first transfer this this shard, I guess, I don't know how we call it these days, but basically this part of Gitly first and limit and do it like line by line until we transfer everything instead of doing all of it at once.
Yeah, Ash, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so the selective sync we would use that, which allows projects. You can use selective sync either at a group level or project specific level. So we would choose ideally a small project to begin with, and also we have additional configuration options with how many workers we would have per task. So we would set those very low, one worker per, I think there's 4 different tunables. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. So we would set those very low and then to a very small project. So that would, and I guess the amount of work that the secondary would do back or hit back at the primary would be dependent upon how busy that project is. So if it's a very seldom updated project, there's not going to be a huge amount of activity directed at the primary. So and then we could slowly ramp up by increasing the worker number or adding additional projects and go from there.
Okay, and when you say worker, what do you mean exactly?
So we have the difference between a primary and a secondary node is just an additional bunch of workers that are executed, sidekick jobs that are executed on the secondary.
Sidekick jobs then.
Yeah. So we're able to tune how many how many, I guess, workers are running for those jobs. Just trying to, I don't have my Geo set up running at this very important time, but I think I believe there are 4 or 5 tunables that we can
play with. Okay.
Yep.
So the other question, I know we are going over time, but I hope you have 5 more minutes to cover just this one. Paint me a picture of this running in production in full. I'm interested from the perspective of infrastructure cost. So let's say staging is our playground right now. Ideal case, what do we expect to run on top of what we are currently running on staging if we have Geo fully enabled, like all data sources, database, and so on?
I mean, I can give you one answer, right? Which is and this is a business decision. I think,
of course, that's why I'm asking.
Right, if the goal here is to have Geo fully enabled so that we can fail over fast in case of a proper disaster on .com, then I think by and large you would mirror the infrastructure, right? So at that point, if that is the expectation, right, you would have, I think, very similar infrastructure for Geo that you would have to for .com, which then obviously doubles the cost.
Mm-hmm.
If the expectation is, that, we would be able to spin up, let's say, more database nodes or things like that, then it could be lower, but I don't exactly know how that would work from infrastructure perspective.
I think then that's where we have to work with infrastructure to decide how Geo actually fits into the disaster recovery capabilities of the system. I know immediately that doubling the cost of the production infrastructure is just never going to be approved. And I think what would be more effective is to say that in terms of a complete failover playground, we use staging as a failover playground to be able to prove out that what we're releasing to customers, you can do failovers and you can spin things up and spin things down and promote and demote and all those good things. And we use staging for all of that. But on the production side, we work more closely with infrastructure to be able to say, in order to meet the recovery time objectives for these particular data types, we recommend that you do this with Geo. We're going to have these types of nodes. If we want to be able to restore repositories in under 2 hours, this is the process that we would need to follow to be able to say, activate this, go here, this is where your data is, this is how you pull it back, and be very specific about the use of Geo for production. So I think we have to be very careful in how we tailor what Geo offers the production instance, and it needs to be quite separate from what is going to happen on the staging environment. Mm-hmm. I mean, at the moment, what I'm looking for is we just need to get it installed and running, and then we can have all of those discussions about, in order to get these benefits, this is what we're going to have to do next. I'm concerned that if we're going all the way to the end of that and thinking all the way to the end of the project, that we're not actually going to get to the point of installing it.
I understand what you're saying, Rachel. I'm not trying to over-optimize here. I'm just trying to understand the paths that we can take. So at this moment in time, to me, it feels like too much work to actually go down the route of planning even for syncing any other data sources, to tell you the truth. So I think what we should do next is, and when I say we, I think the 3 of you, we should do next is do some napkin math on, I can help you with understanding how staging is set up, but Ash probably already knows a lot of that anyway. And then do some napkin math on what do we expect to add cost-wise, what do we expect to get out of that experiment with the databases, and how much actual work you think from the Geo side will be. And I'm going to contribute from the side of infrastructure to understand how much work that will be. Once we have that, I would like to go to, well, I'm not going to ask for approval. We're just going to start working on it, but I am going to inform people of what we are trying to achieve. And start the discussions on what do we want to see as our disaster recovery plan, and not even just disaster recovery, but where do we want to see Geo on .com, and whether we even want to see it on .com.
Maren, do you know who actually owns the disaster recovery strategy for .com? Who's the DRI for that?
No one.
Ah, okay.
That's a bit disconcerting.
I know that Dave's team was working on this prior. You worked with him previously there, but as far as I know, currently we don't have anyone assigned specifically to this alone. We have three reliability teams and delivery team inside of infra, and we don't even know where to turn work-wise, how like with the amount of work that is thrown at us.
Okay. Well, I think in terms of next steps for this, Ash is going to continue working on getting this deployed to staging. We've also got some time from Devon at the moment and some other SREs that Jerry has very kindly offered to us, or offered the use of for us. So Ash and Devon are going to be spending some time pairing together to get further with deploying to staging. I understand what you're also going to need from us is what the expectations are once we have this in staging. This is what we expect to achieve by having this done. Yep. So I can go back and update the epic that we have to get this to staging to list out these are the benefits we're hoping to see. This is what we're going to use it for. And I think that this discussion today has been quite useful to just help me verbalize some of that out. And I can take what I've said in this recording and put it onto the epic itself. So I'll do that sometime this week. And then I understand also the next steps from there is you also want to know more about how many machines we're going to be using so that there's a bit of a cost estimate done there. And I think that once Ash and Devon are a little bit further along with where they are at the moment, because there's discussions now happening about what nodes, what machine types and sizes should we be using and for what purpose. So once we have more clear indication of that, I can add it to that epic as well.
Yep. Sounds good. Are we okay with stopping the recording?
Yep.
Thank you.
I will stop the recording. This recording I will upload to YouTube later and share the link.